Hello, and welcome to the Talk Stew podcast. I am your host, Don Kloss. In this podcast series, I speak on topics that are an amalgam of science, philosophy, history, religion, sociology and society, business, language, literature, the arts, and even politics and beyond. I am not supported by any company, organization, or other entity. This podcast is not a Patreon. It is free, and you are encouraged to subscribe to this YouTube channel. The views expressed in the series are entirely my own and from my own experience and worldview. Talk Stew is a podcast originating from Columbus, Ohio. You can send your comments to me at my email address, 5254dkloss@gmail.com. In this edition, I take a look at Congress and ask the question, do we really need two parties? I begin this program with a look at Carl Schmitt. Schmitt was a member of the Nazi Party and an anti-Semite. He was born on July 11th, 1888, and died on April 7th, 1985. He was a jurist and a political theorist, and while he was a member of the Nazi Party and never apologetic about it, he hit the nail on the head in more than a couple of areas. One thing is that he attacked what was known at the time as liberalism, and it is not the same kind of liberalism we think of in politics today. In his view, once you got yourself involved in politics in any way, you set yourself up for being in a position where you had friends and you had enemies. Your friends were the people in your party, and your enemies were the people not in your party. And we have this today. We have Democrats versus Republicans. We have liberals versus conservatives. We have left-wingers versus right-wingers, and so on. Schmitt said that there were two things that made up liberalism as he saw it in his time. The first was something called constitutionalism. And constitutionalism he defined as a complicated concept in which government powers were limited by a higher law, not arbitrary judgments like you would have in the case of sovereigns, like kings, for example, monarchies. Government was not free to just do as it pleased. The second part of this was what he called cosmopolitism, which was the idea that all humans were seen as world citizens in a universal community. And more specifically, this was defined as different peoples from different walks of life and different races showing mutual respect and tolerance of their differences. He also indicated that nationalism and dictatorships were more in line with the idea of executive power than what is defined as executive power in our Constitution. And in constitutionalism, which we jumped into when we wrote a constitution, is that political power and law puts a short leash on the executive power, who is really a sovereign in president's clothing. With sovereigns like kings, authoritarianisms, it creates an illusion, according to him, that there isn't a sovereign when everything is going along fine and is normal. But on the occasions where it is needed, because there is no set of laws that can cover every contingency or emergency, then the executive power, in our case, the president, becomes a sovereign. So during normal times, when everything is just going along as usual, we rely on the Constitution for our laws and for our limiting of what the executive powers are. But once there is an emergency, something along the lines of a war, your country being invaded by another country, then it's time for the laws to kind of go to the wayside, and that executive power, that person who is your president, let's say in a democratic society, it's time for the sovereign in that person to come out. Time for them to take control and make the big decisions. We have seen in our history that this is exactly what happened in the wars that we have been involved in. When we declared war on Japan, that was something that was headed up by our president. The president declared war on Japan. The same happened with Germany in World Wars I and II, and the same for Vietnam and Korea. Now the thing about, so that is a part of the equation, and the other part is this idea of friends and enemies, political parties. Now, we all know we have a Democratic Party and a Republican Party, and we know from the news and from media otherwise that they are often at odds. And I did a little research and reread the Constitution of the United States and reread all of the amendments, and they are very specific about there being a House and a Senate and everything about it, how old you must be in order to be a senator or a member of the House, how long the terms are, the rules for the elections, and so on and so on. However, there is absolutely nothing in the Constitution or the amendments that say we have to have 2 parties, 3 parties, whatever. Parties are not mentioned at all. And the thing I wonder about this is, when I think back, and I know how many members of Congress there are, and I see from the news I read how much they accomplish and don't accomplish in a year, and I see how often the two parties are at odds and the passing of certain bills gets stalled, sometimes for years because of this, it makes me wonder if we would be better off if we did not have two parties. It often seems that a bill gets stalled or shot down in the House or the Senate just because you have congressmen of one party or the other who just seem to be against whatever the congressmen in the other party are trying to accomplish. There seems to be animosity, and there seems to be this competition between them for power. We have seen just within the last year how much of a stir it caused with the Democrats getting control of the House. This is something that the Republicans absolutely did not want, were afraid of, tried to keep from happening. And you have to take a look at, there are hundreds of bills proposed to Congress every year, but look at how often you hear in the news or read that one actually passed. And look at how often others are shot down in either the House or the Senate. A lot of this, to my mind, seems to be related to this friend versus enemy position that these Congress people take. How often do we hear from these politicians, I'm going to vote against this bill because I think the other party is off the rockers, or I think the other party is going beyond bounds. It happens all the time. I compare this to the corporate world that I spent some 37 years in. And within a corporation, you have this mass group of people that are all working towards a single goal, which is selling as much of a certain product as possible. And you don't have two different sides. You don't have some people within the corporation that want to push that product and others that don't. That would be totally counterproductive to the business objective of the corporation. Now think of that same thing in terms of our government. If there were not parties and everyone was just a senator or a representative of the House working towards getting bills passed or not passed, and not working along party lines, if everything was nonpartisan, wouldn't we get a lot more done? Wouldn't we have bills looked at in a much more constructive fashion? Wouldn't we have these pieces of paper that are so important looked over and studied and worked on and revised and either passed or not passed in a much more constructive fashion with an eye towards what is best for the country, what is best for the constituents, the citizens, the society, as opposed to what's going to be best for our party or what's going to look best on our party. Again, with the analogy about corporations, you don't have people in the marketing department of a pharmaceutical company, for example, purposely trying to make a commercial that will dive bomb and sink the sales for that particular product just because that person doesn't believe in it, or that person doesn't like somebody else that he's working with. They would lose their job very shortly if they did that. It doesn't happen. Their job is to make that product look good to the public. That's what they get paid to do, and that is what they do. Well, again, the same thing could happen within Congress if we did not have parties. Everybody not thinking about partisanship, everybody working to either pass bills or not pass bills on their merit, on their benefit to the country and the constituents. To have a senator say to himself, I'm going to vote against this bill, not because the people on the other side of the aisle want it, but because I think there are some flaws in it, or I think it's not a benefit, or I think it's harmful, or I think it needs to be rewritten in a different way. That is constructive, not destructive, and that is totally nonpartisan. And I just think that we would get, as I said, a lot more accomplished in the course of a year, in the course of the time that these senators and representatives are in their seats. Along with this, we, as voters, would end up in a situation where we are voting for certain congressmen, certain senators, certain House members, even officials that are elected at the state and local levels, not because they belong to Party A or Party B, but because we have to be responsible for researching what these people's qualifications are, what they stand for, and voting for who we think is going to be the best fit and do the best job in whatever position they were running for, and not because they are a member of Party A or a member of Party B. And this extends to the president and the vice president as well. If you think about what a huge position that is, and what kind of power, executive power, that person wields, and the fact that in a time of an emergency, such as our country being attacked by another nation, you would be voting for that person based on their track record in politics, based on what is known about them in terms of our view of who we think will do the best job, and not because of they belong to Party A or they belong to Party B. It's the most important position politically in our country, and we want the right person. We want somebody who is going to do the best job, and we don't want a ear tag associated with it that says, I'm this or I'm that. Vote for me for what I believe in, for what you know about me, my strengths and weaknesses. And besides not basing it on what party that person belongs to, think about what they say their plans would be and their objectives as president, but don't base it on promises. Anybody can make promises and not keep them. In fact, politicians quite often make promises by the bagful, and quite often almost none of them ever pan out. So promises really are kind of a waste. Promises are maybes. Promises are not things that you can count on more heavily than not count on, can expect more heavily than expect to fall through. And without parties, you're not going to get into these situations where a bill gets passed in Congress and the president vetoes it just because the people that got it passed happen to be a different party from his party. That is very counterproductive. It wastes a lot of time. It wastes a lot of taxpayer money. And it just does not seem like a good way to try and accomplish anything. So that's my 2 cents on that topic. It's just food for thought coming from my point of view. Think it over. Thank you for listening. And again, please send your comments to my email address at 5254dkloss@gmail.com.